So that was Simon and Garfunkel, Sounds of Silence. And I wanted to start with that because they create an image, they create a juxtaposition of wild cacophony with silence. And I don't know about you, but I know for myself, so much in the world seems to be about wild cacophony. We are always in the midst of change. Athenian philosopher Heraclitus identified that change is the only constant in our lives. And yet, even though this has been a teaching that has been described and discussed for thousands of years, and Heraclitus is the first person in the West, we know that there are Eastern traditions that teach the same thing. Nonetheless, each of us come to a point where we are faced with change and we may find ourselves troubled. I used to generally think of myself as a change embracing, change loving kind of person. I've been involved in a lot of things to evoke, provoke, sustain, push change forward. And I'm at a time now where I saw the aftermath of a conversation that happened in the White House between two national presidents. And I didn't see, I saw a president and I saw a bully. I saw a person who was, well, I wasn't even looking at the VP. I just saw somebody who has so much difficulty struggling with his emotional regulation. Now, I work with this a lot in middle school. Helping to teach students about emotional regulation is something that we're really working on. And I have to say it's challenging when the so-called leader of our country is somebody who wrestles with their own emotional regulation. They're so soft-skinned, thin-skinned, that the notion of any hard question is met with getting rid of anyone that will ask the questions. So that's my context that we're in. And it really has come as a shift since World War II, the United States has been a place that has stood up against national bullies. We've stood up against dictators. We've stood up against, and I'm using the word against very deliberately. Science of mind often goes with the notion that we should only be for things and not against things. And I just want to say, yeah, we can be for things, and when we're standing in the for, there are things that we are not promoting. So for years, you know, Stephanie, Victor, Phyllis all have historical heritage in African citizens who were dragged and enslaved and brought over to this country, and then this country built wealth on their labor, on their backs. Reba and Shiri, as Jewish women, have centuries of Jewish oppression. And that Jewish oppression continues to bubble up, continues to be promoted and provoked. Because one of the things that bullies do is bullies love to divide. They love to divide and conquer. So the talk title is Navigating the Tides of Our Lives. And I just want to pull up a quick little video segment that generates where this idea came from. And I have to be able to do the share. Yeah. Okay.
Like sands through the hourglass, so are the days of our lives.
So where's the stop share? Okay. And I'm going to keep sharing for just a moment. Now, in the days of our lives, we're seeing sand go through the hourglass. And, if we think about the change within that hourglass, that sand doesn't go very far. That sand doesn't face very much. So relatively speaking, that change is not a big deal. Now I want to show another clip where the sand is making maybe a bigger change.
The mystery of life isn't a problem to solve, but a reality to experience.
Stop share. The reason I wanted to juxtapose those two things is in the hourglass of the time of the days of our lives. The notion connecting to the tides of our lives, the tides, the times, the days of our lives, the sand is only dropping, maybe 3 inches. And in that scene from Dune, the sand is traveling much more quickly. And the metaphor in the days of our lives motif is that there's always stuff that's changing. And when the hourglass is done, you turn it over and it's changing again. I wanted to throw in the thing from Dune, though, because sometimes the changes in our lives feel like they're coming at us at a velocity and rate that is overwhelming. And what's happening in that particular scene is that craft that Paul and his mother are in is being pursued by several other crafts that are wanting to destroy them. And going into the sandstorm is really their only escape. How often might we feel like going into the storm is our only choice? And yet within that scene, Paul's mother identifies that fear, if we go into change in a state of fear, the words are, fear is the mind killer. One of the things that I learned last week, and you all probably know this already, but the part of the brain that manages fear is called the amygdala. And it's this little kind of walnut-shaped part of the brain at the center of the brain. And this is where all of our reactions, fight, flight, and freeze, that's where they all come from. And the big thing that I learned is that the more we're exposed to stressors, the more that we're exposed to anxiety, the more that we're exposed to things, and we don't react to it in a more soothing way, that amygdala grows. They find that people who have been through trauma and through chronic anxiety have bigger amygdalas. And that means that part of the brain that's built for managing fear, that's built for responding with fight, flight, or freeze, is just getting bigger and making more connections. We also know that all of our brains developed at a time when we lived in a world where it was important to have that fight, flight, or freeze. You go outside, you hear something kind of creaking in the woods, it might be a bear, it might be a lion, it might be a cougar. The idea is that it might be something that wants to eat us. And so having that fear reaction was not a bad thing, it was an evolutionary good thing. But now we live in a world where the fear is generated by virtual stuff. Again, one of the other things that I learned at the conference that I attended was that many people spend so much of our time just scrolling through our phone. And the scrolling through our phone generates the very self-same emotional reactivity that being out in the wilderness with that lion roaring in the distance generates and creates. What I also learned is that basically the language was used, cell phone hygiene, is something that can really support us. How many know that, if you're watching your screen from dawn till dusk till right before you go to bed, it's much harder to get to sleep. The speaker proposed the idea that, and she knows this because she worked for companies that develop this, the phone is designed to keep us engaged, to make us want to see it. It is so bright and colorful. Those different apps are so engaging and delightful. Victor knows this because Victor is learning to draw and create images. He is creating images that are going to capture. He isn't creating images that people are like, ho-hum. Victor is working on creating these great visual images that inspire. Well, that's what's been put on our phones. So we just can't put it down. The notion of the hygiene that the speaker talked about is, if you just turn the phone to grayscale and get rid of the colors, I hear the gasps in the room. If you just were to get rid of the colors, the amount of time that you're on the phone drops by hours, because we're designed to seek out color, to look for it. And if we're not getting it on the phone, we might look for it in other places. So we're all on board, or hopefully you're all brought on board with me, that we are living in a world of constant change. And hopefully my conversation about the phone has started to lead us to the notion that we are also flooded with false information. Again, I don't know about you, but in that conversation with the president and then that bully, there was false information that was being presented. And the press corps didn't include the Reuters. It didn't include the APA. It included the TASS, which is from Russia's service. That was who was at the press conference. So increasingly, we are in a place of false information pushed on us. Michael, I dragged Michael into watching John Oliver last week, and John Oliver was speaking about how Facebook, Meta, Facebook, Meta, X, they've dismissed with fact checking. Because why would we need that? Why would we need fact checkers? Someone will respond. And in that response, we may hear that something might be false. We are being filled and pumped. So if this was like the electric car thing we're being electrified with, or the old time gas pump, we're being pumped full of false stuff. As children, we were filled with false stuff. There were messages about what we should be. Messages for things that we should live up to. Messages for ways we should look. Stephanie talked about this last week. She had a dumpy seventh or eighth grade boy say, come into a room and say there aren't any pretty girls here. Well, this was a dumpy seventh or eighth grade boy. Seventh or eighth grade boys are not good judges of beauty. They're not good judges of much of anything. And apologies to any former men or male gendered people who were seventh grade boys that made stupid judgments. I feel fortunate because really as a queer, I wasn't really looking at the girls. I was always looking at the boys. I just wasn't going up to the boys and telling them, you'd look better if you did X or whatever. We have been flooded with ways we're supposed to be. And yet, we're also equipped with a sense within ourselves that identifies the truth for who and what we are. And we know that experience, it's been described by Emerson as that still small voice. But to hear the still small voice, we have to get quiet. We can't be present to the still small voice if we just are scrolling, and each thing that pops up, it's another thing that is filling us. Eckhart Tolle talked about how we can push silence away rather than responding to our sense of boredom and asking, what is it calling forth from us? We're happy to take what's in our minds and in our hearts and push it out into our bodies. One of the things that Ernest Holmes proposed with the Science of Mind teachings, and with the Science of Mind teachings, Ernest Holmes drew from spiritual traditions all over the world. And kind of a consistent tradition is the notion that we're all one, we're all connected. That so-called golden rule, treat your neighbor as yourself. You don't just treat your neighbor as yourself so that you're not treated like crap. It does help, but there's more to it than that. Martin Luther King talked about that. Martin Luther King Jr., I don't want to diss his dad, but Martin Luther King Jr. is the one that's credited with it, is the notion that justice for any one person is justice for every person. And an injustice against one person is an injustice for every person. This notion of oneness is something with a long tradition, a long heritage. And increasingly, we're in a time where the notions of oneness is being struck away. It's being pushed out the door. And the question is, are we going to be victims of what's happening in the world? Or are we going to be mindful about how to respond to what's happening around us? And you're all here, so I'm assuming you're going for mindfulness rather than victimhood. Okay, so I'm going to give us 3 notions for dealing mindfully rather than victimly. So we're going to do pause, we're going to do watch and listen, and we're going to do flow. Pause, watch and listen, and flow. There's 3 things. Now, these 3 things are important. Write them down because they're going to be your life work for this week. These are not merely ideas. These are practices to engage. And practices don't really work all that well. If anybody ever took piano lessons like I did, I would meet with my piano teacher. We'd go through things, and then she'd say, "This is what I want you to practice." And I was not a great piano student. As you may notice, I do not play piano here because I never really took my piano practice seriously. I was doing it because my mother wanted a piano. And if she had a piano, she had to have one of the kids taking piano lessons. And my sister was like, "I'm doing the clarinet. You can't make me." So it landed on me. And I'm like, "I'm already playing guitar." "No, you're going to play the piano." "Okay, Mom." Anyhow, so pause, watch and listen, and flow. So with regard to pause, we can either be going on autopilot or we can be going consciously. Now, take a moment and consider how successful things are when we're on autopilot. Consider how the best conversations, the best relationships were when we were just on autopilot and somebody said something and we just responded. That boss says, "Could you do it this way?" "Fuck, no, I can't do that. I'm sorry. No, I won't do it that way." It was not a successful response. The boss was not happy. "I'd like you to do this." "Well, I don't want to do this." That's the autopilot. That auto little voice that pops right up and says, "Nope, not doing it. Nope, not doing it." That's the kind of reactive autopilot. Again, I can't speak for any of you, but my mother had a whole catalog of ways that I was supposed to respond. Kind of the mantra of if you can't say something nice, don't say anything at all. And I was so happy when I learned about Winston Churchill saying, "If you can't say something nice, come over here and gossip with me in the corner." I had a reactivity that I developed because I felt like I was pushed around an awful lot. And as a queer, faggy little kid, I was pushed around quite a lot. The game selection for the teams would happen and the game would start and I'd still be on the sideline. So I learned how to make myself a little bit more visible. But that reactivity wasn't the best way. If I were to do everything from what I was as a 9-year-old, I don't know that my life would be as successful as it is. I don't know how many of us want to rely on our 9 or 13-year-old or 17-year-old or 27-year-old or even 40 or 52-year-old decision-making process. My suspicion is that we've all evolved from that. And rather than operating on the autopilots that were installed and seemingly working at 9 or 12 or 15 or 17 or 18 or 30 or whatever, when we turn the autopilot off, we pause and we turn the autopilot off. We can stand in the question and consciously consider, am I going to breathe into this space and move forward? Or am I just going to go along with it? I've told stories before about how I had people pushing one of my school psychologists. You've got to test this kid. You've got to test this kid because they are leaving the classroom and they can't leave the classroom because that's not safe. And my school psychologist had explained to them, they're leaving the classroom because the classroom is so chaotic. The child is looking for peace. And this teacher is ill-equipped to afford this child with peace. And if we lay everything on this child and we don't call the adult to responsibility, then we'll have just another black boy in a pull-out all day long classroom for emotionally disordered black boys. And the rest of the class gets screwed up. And my school psychologist said, this is not a problem with this child. In fact, this child has clearly identified, I'm leaving the room because it's so disordered. And I'm only stepping outside of the doorway so that I can get peace. And what that school psychologist said, and then what I coached on and what I kept pushing on was that child, that 5-year-old child, has far more emotional regulatory skills than the rest of the classroom combined. This is a child who's gifted, not a child who needs to be pulled out. But I pissed my supervisor off. My supervisor was like, well, we don't want to hear this. And I'm like, well, that's fine. I know you don't want to hear that what you're engaging in is a racist practice. I know you don't want to hear that, but that's what's going on here. This is a black boy who has left the classroom. He's not creating any harm for anyone. He's not going to a place that he can't be found. He is simply outside the door. And your desire to take him out of that classroom and put him into a place where there are emotionally disabled kids is a racist practice. And of course, what did my supervisor say to me? You're calling me a racist. And again, if I wasn't operating in a considered way, I would have been all like, oh, did I call her racist? I'm like, no, if you read what I sent you, I said racist practice. Now, if you're seeing that racist practice as your own identification, if that's how you're identifying with a racist practice, if in fact you are racist, practicing racist practices, then you might want to do some work. And again, my one supervisor was like, I don't know why you would say that to a supervisor. I said, because I've committed to being an anti-racist, abolitionist educator, which is what I believe the Seattle School District wants for all of its educators. And if I've misunderstood the policies that the board established, if I've misunderstood the practices that have been put into place, let me know. Otherwise, I'm going to stand by what I wrote, and I do not intend to apologize because in point of fact, I did not call that person a racist. Bubble overhead, I think they're a racist. I think it's pretty obvious that they're a racist. But the practice of pausing, let me respond from a place of positivity and equanimity rather than victimhood. So these are the times to pause. Do you feel like a victim? Is everything happening to you? Pause. Pause that. When are we letting our nationality, our language, our race, our color, or anything physical define us? When are we letting that be the centerpiece of who we are? Pause and breathe when we realize that we can be the navigator through this circumstance rather than the thing that's haplessly dragged along there. Finally, pause when we see a moment where things are breaking up. And rather than being broken in that broken up moment, how do we connect to the one source of all? Those are the times when to pause. So that's pause. Everybody got that? Thumbs up, thumbs down. You're in the neighborhood. You've got the pause. Okay. Now the next thing is we are pausing, and now that we are in that moment of pause, now's the time to watch and listen in silence. In the song, Sounds of Silence, Simon and Garfunkel back in the 60s spoke about how we were losing our capacity to listen, how we were losing our capacity to see, because we were coming in with pre-filtered visions and understandings. We weren't stopping and letting ourselves truly listen. I know people have talked about it. You get into a conversation and you just boom, launch into it. And if you're responding to something that a person didn't actually say, how successfully does that conversation go? Or when we know we're in a conversation with somebody who just is not going to be amenable, how many times do we like to push it? Just because it's fun. It's a little bit fun to watch them get ruffled. This is something that I watched a lot when my dad's wife, Carol, would get together in meetings or in situations with my ex-wife's father, Al. And Al would say something, and then Carol would say the exact opposite. And it was like she knew that she was trying to like push all of his buttons. And she was very successful. She would get all of his buttons. And his voice would raise, and he'd be like, "You just don't understand." And it's like, excuse me, I know you're a doctor, but I have a master's in this, and I do understand it. And it would really disturb him. And the thing would escalate. And again, I tell this story, but how many times do we find ourselves so sucked in to that same thing that, Michael used to talk about a dog that used to have the last yap. That last yap. How often do we want to have the last yap? With watching and listening in silence, it's like we say, wait a second, I have paused and I am assessing, am I longing for the last yap? Am I longing to be the last dog barking? How often can we just let go? Our grip on something. Eckhart Tolle says, when you stop believing everything you think, you step out of the thinking and see clearly that the thinking is not who you are. Now, I'll say that again. When you stop believing everything you think and you step out of the thinking and see clearly that the thinker is not who you are. Use those capacities to watch and listen in silence. Watching and listening in silence, we bring it into silence rather than into rebuke or self-aggrandizing response. You know how wrong you are. Let me tell you how wrong you are. Keep that as a bubble. If the silence is too hard, just imagine putting it in a bubble. And Stephanie has led us in meditations where we see ourselves wrapped in pink light. We can have those thoughts that are like, zinger, oh, this is a really great zinger. Oh, I know I could really cut this person down with this. Wrap the thought in a pink bubble and let it go. Give your little ego a pat on the back and say, look at how clever you were. You came up with a beautiful response. Now, it wouldn't have brought peace. It wouldn't have brought you any closer. It wouldn't have made things any easier, but boy, it was a really clever response. Give yourself credit that way, rather than saying it and figuring out how am I going to dig myself out of this later. So watch and listen in silence. Got it? Okay, number 3, flow. Flow. Now, you would think flow would be really easy, right? And Jeffrey just said, so for the people that couldn't hear it, yeah, like a rock in the middle of the stream. How often do we become rocks in the middle of the stream and we are just unwilling to go with the flow? Screw that flow. I'm not going to be part of that flow. But when there is so much tumult around us, where are the places that we can flow? How do we look for the flow? How do we look for the movement? How do we look for capacities to join in with others in movement? I mean, apparently in response to President Zelensky and the bully of our country getting together, a lot of people have stood up and said, I don't like where this is taking our country. I don't like that we are abandoning relationships that we have held since 1900, and we're just letting them go so that we can pick Russia. I don't like it. Pushing us, and where have we opened to new ideas and new possibilities? How do we create an opening for wisdom? From that book, Dune, one of the characters wrote a process, or one of the characters described in the writing, a process cannot be understood by stopping it. We must move with the flow of the process. We must join it. We must flow with it. He's saying with the camera. So, going with the flow doesn't simply mean that we just let things happen. But going with the flow means that we may join and look for movement. Where is movement happening? And where do we consciously want to be with it? So my invitation this week is to pause. When things are troubling, rather than simply reacting, we can pause. We can stop. We can engage in any number of practices. So it might be just taking a deep breath. And then following it with another deep breath. One of the things I learned from my speaker a couple of weeks ago was the notion that if you close your eyes for merely 10 seconds, we increase the alpha waves in our brain. And alpha waves are one of the things that happens when we're in the midst of dreaming. Now, I certainly wouldn't recommend closing our eyes while we're driving. Please refrain from that. 10 seconds is a long time. But in terms of mindfulness practices, there is breathing. There is simply shutting our eyes for 10 minutes. A couple of other things that are very easy to do are walking from the ball of our foot to the toe, from the heel of our foot to the toe. That each step we are heel to toe walking. Maybe walking 10 steps that way may give us a moment to pause. I'm not saying to take a 100-mile hike. I'm saying to simply walk, feeling your whole foot on the ground one at a time, stepping forward. Another possibly easy thing is to do a vegetation bath. You just go into a park, you go into a field, you go into a backyard, and just sit in the presence of nature. Just sit in the presence of nature. Take it in. You could do a sound bath. Is there a particular song that you find inspiring? Put the song on to deliberately engage. All of those are ways that you might pause. And if those don't work, email me and we'll navigate some other possibilities. Watch and listen. In our conversations, spend more time watching and listening. One of the things that I did after going to the presentations 2 weeks ago was that I made sure I became much more conscious when I was with kids to just sit there with the kids rather than my habit of getting up and looking at my computer to make sure some email hasn't come in and then getting back down with the kid. How do I make myself present to them? I was told that simply keeping the phone out of sight can be less triggering. So I use my phone instead of a stopwatch. I'm going to buy a stopwatch so that I'm not using my phone, so that my phone isn't what's out. And that way I can keep my phone in a place that isn't visible to the kids. Where and how can we watch and listen? What conversations might we have with the people in our lives? All of those are great places to watch and listen. And finally, in terms of flow, when we've paused and when we're watching and listening, we've opened ourselves up in a way to be more present to life, to be more present to the oneness. We're no longer caught up in our thoughts and emotions. We're more receptive to the possibilities. So I have an affirmation and then I have a closing song. Change. So here's the affirmation. Because I did what? Oh, okay. So the affirmation, you're going to have to remember it. You're not going to get to see it. Yeah, I can get it. It says. Okay. I flow through the tides of life. I flow through the tides of life. I flow through the tides of life. And so it is. Okay. And the song?